This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. I may be joined later by Dee Pierce, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends. But right now, I don't know whether she's available tonight. So we will have to see. But we have two main topics for tonight. One is on the U.S.-Iran situation, particularly what Trump is going to do with Iran, whether he's going to negotiate or whether he's going to bomb Iran. And the other topic is on tariffs. And we have much more on tariffs today from Bob Hockett, Whitney Pepe Escobar, and Wabin. Some very, very good articles on tariffs. And then I'll be making some comments too in light of the recent work that I did on tariffs and reported about in my last show. So please do share, like, and subscribe. I know I'm competing with Bernie Sanders, who's out in Folsom, California, giving a speech tonight. And Ocasio-Cortez, of course, is there with him, and God knows who else. But anyway, this will be a very good show. So, the Earl of Lurl is here. Hello, Earl. I am happy to greet you. We have a number of other people here too, but they are not visible at this point, so I'm not able to greet them. But I'm going to get right into the business of tonight. Our first piece is one from Larry Johnson, the ex-CIA agent, who was very active in live streaming, appearing on other people's show, and also blogging of late. And he had a particularly good piece on April 12th. The title of it is Iran/US Scenario 2 in Play. Ball is now in Trump's court, and Trump's blinks first in China showdown. Wow. I thought this was a showdown with Iran, but I guess China's somehow involved too. So we'll get into that. There's a picture of Trump with a basketball in some kind of pain. I don't know what kind of t-shirt he's wearing there, what kind of jersey he's wearing. Larry says, looks like the second scenario I outlined in my last article. What to expect from the U.S.-Iran negotiation in Oman. Is the winner. That is the second scenario is the winner. But don't start popping champagne corks just yet, says Larry. Excuse me. Between the Iranian and U.S. Negotiators, i.e. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, or Araghchi, I should say, and Trump's pal Steve Witkoff, to meet next Saturday is very good news. In contrast with Witkoff's refusal to deal directly with Hamas, today's, quote, indirect, unquote, talk session ended with direct contacts between Araghchi and Witkoff. Personal chemistry is important. Let's not forget that Araghchi was in Moscow earlier this week coordinating and discussing Iran's proposals with his counterparts from Russia and China. By the way, I have it on pretty good authority that Witkoff met for 5 hours with Putin. Extraordinary long time for him to have a diplomatic meeting with someone. That must have been very educational for Witkoff. Going on, I'm certain that the Russians and the Chinese played a role in persuading Iran to offer the U.S. a proposal that they believed could be acceptable to Witkoff, or at least provide grounds for further discussions. Witkoff's task is difficult. While he has the backing of Trump, the proposal offered by Iran is likely to enrage the Zionist cabal that surrounds Trump, i.e., Michael Waltz, National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and CIA Director John Radcliffe. The Gray Zone's Max Blumenthal reports that AIPAC considers those three as reliable lackeys. During an off-the-record panel, AIPAC's CEO detailed his organization's grooming of Trump's national security officials and how his group's access, quote-unquote, ensures they continue to follow Israel's agenda. The Gray Zone has obtained the audio of an off-the-record session from the 2025 Congressional Summit of AIPAC, the main U.S. lobbying arm of the State of Israel. Recorded by an attendee of the panel discussion. The audio features AIPAC's new CEO, his name is Elliot Brand, describing how his organization has cultivated influence with three top national security officials in the Trump administration: Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Director Mike Waltz, and CIA Director John Radcliffe, and how it believes it can gain access, quote unquote, to their internal discussions. Referring to Trump's Secretary of State Marco Rubio, his National Security Director Waltz, and Elise Stefanik, whose nomination to serve as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations was suddenly withdrawn to preserve the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Brandt explained to AIPAC members, quote, "Those three people have something in common. They all served in Congress. After relying heavily on pro-Israel donors to fuel their campaigns for office, they all have relationships with key AIPAC leaders from their communities," said the AIPAC CEO. Quote, "So the lines of communication are good should there be something questionable or curious, and we need access on the conversation," unquote. Trump is going to come under enormous pressure to add additional conditions to the proposal now on the table, e.g., elimination of Iran's nuclear program, also elimination of Iran's missiles, and or an end to all support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. If the Zionist crowd succeeds in clubbing Witkoff like a baby seal, and Witkoff is forced to return to Oman with one or more of these, quote, new, unquote, conditions, the Iranians will walk away, and the possibility of a deal to prevent war will evaporate. Trump now holds the success or failure of his presidency in his own hands. If he endorses the Witkoff deal, he will earn the enmity of the Zionist cabal, but he will have a credible deal that will likely mark the end of the Iranian interest in building a nuclear weapon. Trump will have J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard in his corner, along with his son Don Jr., and the support of friends like Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk. Witkoff already is a target of attacks by some unnamed Republicans over his negotiations with Russia. Quote, Witkoff, an old friend of Trump's, who has helped secure key diplomatic victories for the president, has garnered some support from the Republican Party's Ukraine skeptics, but his proposals have stoked outrage among other Republicans who believe the administration has turned too sharply towards Moscow. Excuse me again. Some Republicans on Capitol Hill were so concerned about Witkoff's apparent pro-Russia stance in the Carlson interview that several called National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Secretary of State Marco Rubio afterward to complain, according to a person familiar with the calls. After he briefs Trump on his talks with the Iranian delegation, you can bet every penny you own that the details will be hastily linked to every pro-Israel loon in Congress, and the howls of protest will erupt. While Donald Trump is busy protecting that he is still a powerful political juggernaut, the reality is that the base that elected him is starting to fracture, and Trump is being forced to reverse himself on some key tariffs levied on China. In a classic Washington political move, Trump waited until Friday night to wave a white flag, effectively surrendering to China on a critical technology. According to the Wall Street Journal, smartphones, laptop computers, memory chips, and other electronics will be exempt from President Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs, another step back that could ease some consumer concerns about an immediate jump in costs for tech products imported from China. Now here, I have to add that new products are getting introduced by Tesla. One is a smartphone. It's coming in at an unbelievable price point. I've seen quotes like, $229 or something like that, unbelievably low. He also has a new television set that's being introduced. That's a new, very large screen television set for something like $189. And I suspect he's probably having those manufactured in China, or at least a lot of the parts manufactured in China, so he can afford to sell them at that price. And of course, he won't be able to meet that price if there are tariffs on that. So, maybe Elon Musk got to him about that, because his plans didn't include heavy tariffs on China, I'm quite sure, such as the 145%, which Trump was most likely considering. New guidance published late Friday by U.S. Customs and Border Protection also exempts machines used to create semiconductors plus products, including computer monitors, tablets, Apple Watches, and computers from the tariffs Trump imposed in his April 2nd executive order, which mandated levies of 10% of the value of almost all U.S. imports and set higher rates on imports from some countries. This is not the last of Trump reversing draconian tariffs. You can expect to learn of more late-night news dumps during the coming weeks, says Larry Johnson. So I thought that was interesting news, partly about the tariffs, but also just the first successful meeting that Witkoff and his Iranian counterpart have had. It's very, very important. They got beyond that first meeting, and they're having another meeting next Saturday night. That suggests that Witkoff has gone back to the United States to talk to Trump about an Iranian proposal, and then he'll be coming back to convey the messages of Donald Trump to the Iranians. And then we will see if there's any chance of getting a deal between them. That would be very important because I think a war with Iran would be catastrophic. And, I have forgotten to share this out. So if you'll excuse me for a moment, I am going to share this out on Facebook. See if it can get us some traction. We are way under our normal level of attendance here. So let's go to our second item.
Gold that's right for you.
Which is a piece by Alistair Crook on the judges program. I'm going to play that.
Alistair, good day to you, my friend, and welcome here. Before we get to your fascinating analysis of Donald Trump and chaos, let's talk a bit about Benjamin Netanyahu and chaos. How, in your view, how stunned was the Israeli prime minister when he was sitting in the Oval Office next to the American president, who announced that the United States would soon commence direct negotiations with the government of Iran?
Yes, he was shocked. He says he knew beforehand, but it seems to me that that's likely not true. He didn't look as if he knew beforehand. His eyes were darting around. He was shocked. Yeah, he was shocked about it, and he's shocked back at home because, according to the Hebrew reports that we've seen, an agreement had already been reached for an attack on Iran between the US and Israel, that the plans were going forward and even a date set for this. And then, so you can imagine this was a shock, yes.
Wow. That piece of news from Alistair was a shock to me. I had no idea they had gone so far as to set a date for a U.S.-Israel attack on Iran. And given that that Alistair is right, based on his contacts inside of Israel, then the news that Trump was going to be negotiating with the Iranians must have been a real stunner, to Netanyahu. Because Netanyahu must have thought all negotiations were over. We're planning an attack. Maybe Trump kind of thought better of it because the success of the Americans against the Houthis has been so limited and so small, and the Houthis' continuous attacks on Israel so relatively persistent and spectacular. And I understand that Trump has also admitted that the Houthis have already sunk some warships of the United States. They haven't sunk a carrier yet, but they have sunk some warships, even though that hasn't quite been made public in terms of details anyway. but evidently Trump has admitted that this is true. Going on with the video.
You say that Netanyahu was of the view that an agreement had been reached. Did this agreement involve Trump, or might it have been Israel Katz and Pete Hegseth?
I can't tell you, but I mean, your friend Ron Dermer was a week in Washington, so I imagine he'd been around everyone that mattered during that time. And then Kurila, the head of CENTCOM, spent a couple of days down in the bunker at the Israeli Ministry of Defense preparing details. But perhaps that was when there was a date set for an attack on Iran. Anyway, you know, for the moment it's on hold. But I would say to you, you mentioned at the outset, you said, you know, the Trump chaos. And really, you know, I think the Iran outcome is going to depend heavily on precisely this chaos. And what do I mean by that? Why do I am saying the chaos is so important? Because that what really spooked Trump during this period, during the time just after he announced his tariffs, according to most of the sort of financial press, was the bond market, not the stock market, but the bond market, the debt market, because that started dropping and yields started rising quite dramatically. And this was upsetting a very delicate trade in the market called the basis trade, which is a sort of very complex, highly leveraged sort of casino bet. And I think Besset was so worried by that he took his airplane and flew down to Mar-a-Lago and said, listen, you've got to start winding this back and got to say there's going to be a moratorium because, you know, if this unravels, if this basis trade unravels, which is about $1 trillion in the market, I mean, we'll be back at 2008 and you'll have a real crisis on your hand.
Okay. We've heard before, and we covered before here, okay, we covered an article from the New Yorker, I believe, if I recall correctly. That was, which also brought up the effects of the bond market and what had been happening, okay, in the bond market. Usually when a crisis occurs of some kind or an unusual event occurs of some kind, the response of the international bond market is to buy into U.S. treasuries as much as they can because they view U.S. treasuries as the safest investment, okay, of all. When a crisis occurs, it's very common for investors to run to the dollar. Here, once the tariff crisis broke, what Besant actually became afraid of was that the investors were running away from the dollar, not toward the dollar. They were refusing to buy bonds, okay, in the open market. Okay, and as a result, in order to sell some of the longer bonds, like the 10-year bonds, it was necessary to offer them at higher interest rates, than the Treasury wanted to offer them. It also looked like the trade in the bond markets was being disturbed. Normal action, was being disturbed. Mm-hmm. There was a flight away from the dollar. Now, that's interesting from a number of points of view. It's unusual, of course. But what's also very interesting is that the Trump administration evidently doesn't know how to counter action by the vigilantes, the bond vigilantes. They don't know what to do about that. Now, generally speaking, the truth is that the combined policy of the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department is usually enough to set the overnight rates, which then have an effect on the Treasury bond rates, so that interest rates are not really determined by the market, but they're determined by the policies being followed by the Treasury and the Fed, often working together to keep the interest rates at a particular level. It seems as though this administration doesn't seem to know what to do about actions in the bond market that are having the effect of raising yields, of raising interest rates, that they seem to know what to do about it. Now, it's really very simple what to do about it, especially if there's a real panic. What to do about it is to stop issuing the damn bonds. Stop issuing them. Now, you might say to me,
I thought they were saying it
they
at
can't.
the beginning of the.
No, they weren't doing that. No. So you might say to me, well, they can't stop issuing the bonds because they're deficit spending and they need to get the money from the bonds. So they can't stop issuing the bonds. Well, the answer is yes, they can stop issuing the bonds. That is, the federal government can do two simple things to provide the money for deficit spending without actually issuing any more bonds. One thing they can do lies with the president. The president can order the Treasury Secretary to order the mint to issue high-value platinum coins. Platinum coins with values worth $1 trillion, $2 trillion, whatever the amount is needed to cover the deficit spending, okay, that's needed. Now, there's a law that gives the Treasury Secretary the authority to do this. And this is a coin law which was passed by Congress in 1996. It's never been used for this purpose, but there are many, many articles about this in terms of the literature. And there's also a book on the subject, which I happen to be the author of. But it's appeared in many more places than in my book, in all kinds of articles, in popular articles, in news articles. Very well-known people have written about it in two previous crises where there was a lot of mention of the platinum coin, the deficit ceiling crisis of 2011, and the debt ceiling crisis, and then the debt ceiling crisis of late 2012 and early 2013. There were numerous articles about the platinum coin. Now, Obama didn't want to issue platinum coins to handle the debt ceiling crisis of 2013 because he was afraid it was going to roil the bond markets. But the bond markets are already roiled, first of all. But second of all, if you mint platinum coins with values that are high enough, then there won't be any bond market for some time to come anyway. So it's not something we'd have to worry about because whatever funding is needed can be covered by the platinum coins that the president can cause to be created and then deposited, at the New York Fed and credited first to the Public Enterprise Fund account of the Mint, and later, after sweeping the profits, the seigniorage can be credited to the Treasury spending account, also resident at the New York Fed. So that's one thing that can be done about it. The other thing that can be done about it is for Congress, which Trump does control, to simply order the Federal Reserve to issue reserves to the Treasury spending account in the amount that's needed to cover whatever deficit is incurred. That, by the way, is a law that can be written in one sentence. If you want to cover whatever debt and interest falls due during the time of all this talking and everything that's going on, all you have to do is include a second sentence. I'm not going to present these two sentences here. I've presented them often enough on this program. But my point is, it only takes two sentences in a short piece of legislation to take total charge of the bond market and to stop all the crap. Now, I'm not saying the administration wants to do that. I'm not sure the Treasury Secretary wants to do that. All I'm saying is that the Trump administration can handle the vigilantes, the bond vigilantes, anytime he so desires. And if he doesn't know how to do it, he can make a call to Professor L. Randall Wray, Bard College, who will be happy to fill him in on the mechanics. Or if he wants to talk to the author of the only book on the platinum coin, he can call me. So, it's not a big thing to handle the bond markets. He didn't really have to withdraw the tariffs in order to handle the bond markets. Now, I hasten to add, I'm glad he withdrew the tariffs, or he paused them for 90 days. I'm glad that he's exempting some of the Chinese products from tariffs, because as I said in the paper I read on tariffs last week, I don't think tariffs are the right thing to do in this instance also. So I'm certainly glad that Trump did the right thing about the tariffs for the wrong reason. And the reason was he was scared of what was going to happen when the bond vigilantes crashed the bond market. That was the wrong reason. The right reason was, let's not crash the whole world economy by starting a tariff war. Anyway, let's go on with Alistair. That's a digression from Alistair's very good video.
Well, that still continues. And why is it so important was because what happened in that crisis, what was the crucial thing that is going to affect the Ukraine war and is going to affect what happens in Iran, was that just Trump managed to hold together the team. He was very worried at points that, that the chaos, the turmoil in the markets, the sort of anger about what was happening on markets was going to split his team. The team is already split. I mean, it's quite clear that some of the coalition, the Republican coalition that was put together, that has existed so far under Trump, was already fragmenting a little bit. Parts of the Republicans in the Senate were getting very antsy, if you don't mind the expression, but very antsy about what was happening to people's share prices and everything, getting very anxious. What has this got to do with Iran? What has it got to do with Ukraine? Well, a lot. The most important thing for Trump, the absolute key to his position, is about doing this reset of the domestic economy, about the economy. about rebalancing the economy so that when the economy is rebalanced, industrial manufacturing will be regained back in the United States. This is what his supporters want. They want the jobs back from this.
Right.
And was what was key about it. So this matters more than anything.
All right.
Okay. So that is a key. But what Trump doesn't understand, what he evidently doesn't understand, and what someone needs to tell him, is you can't have the manufacturing back and you can't have the jobs back in the short term. That's not going to happen, especially using the techniques that Trump has in mind. In other words, the tariffs. He thinks the tariffs is going to bring money flooding back into the United States. That's not what's happening. Obviously, the bond market was moving money away from the United States. Money wasn't going to come flooding into the United States because the tariff walls were up there. You can't do this overnight with something simple. You can't do magic. Trump favors magic. He doesn't understand hard work. He favors solutions that are overnight solutions. The way you get our manufacturing back is a multi-year planning endeavor. It is industrial policy, and it will cost billions and billions, trillions and trillions, of dollars. Biden started the process with a very weak effort. People give him a lot of credit for this very weak effort, but it was a very weak effort. Trump needed to mobilize his political forces to commit to spending trillions on what? On the Green New Deal, the very words that Trump hates. He had to mobilize the government to spend that kind of money to give private businesses here in the United States the incentives to start up, and then he had to protect those businesses with subsidies. He had to pick winners and losers, not just according to who's his cronies, but according to what the people could do business-wise to bring manufacturing back to the United States. It's a long process. It's a process of years. It would fill out his first term. It would bring the jobs back to the United States. But while we're waiting for those jobs to come back, because with all the subsidies we could manage, and with all the industrial policy we could have, it would be a process of years to bring things back. In the meantime, you have to bring jobs back for people. How do you do that? Well, there's a program that's part of Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal, and that's a favorite of MMT economists. It's called the Federal Job Guarantee. And it can immediately bring jobs back to every local area in the country at a socially inclusive living wage if such a program is passed. You want a boost in the economy? You want the economy to be roaring? Put forward an industrial policy. Put forward a Green New Deal. Put forward job guarantee programs. Call in Bernie Sanders and his economists to help you. I know you can't stand these people. But if that's what you want, That's what you got to do. The way you're trying to do it ain't going to work. It's got nothing.
Before we
Then
get in,
what happened to what I was just going to finish off, just
Sure.
to say what really split it, what we see, the big split taking place was caused by Keith Kellogg. Keith Kellogg came back, presented his plan, and several of the team supported him. His plan, just to be clear, was one that would never be accepted by Russia. It was a very hardline pro-Ukrainian plan that would see areas of responsibility. It is quite clear to me that this reflects input from Starmer and Macron and the Europeans, who, as I think everyone on this program knows, are intent on destroying American normalization with Russia. They don't want it. They want to continue the war till 2030. They want a big war in Europe. And so what Kellogg was doing was actually saying that beyond the river Dnieper, there's going to be NATO, British troops, French troops, whatever other troops volunteer, they will be behind the Dnieper. In front of the Dnieper, up to the contact line, would be the Ukrainian forces, and then there would be the Russian forces. So it was a form of, if you like, separation into segments. And of course, this is completely unacceptable to Russia. He should
Right.
know that.
Right.
But he acts as, very much as Ukraine's advocate in these things. And he took with him Rubio, Waltz, and others who said, yeah, this is right. And he contested what was going on. He was contesting what Witkoff was proposing, which was to recognize the four oblasts. As Putin has always said, that is the minimum to start anything moving towards a ceasefire. He said that in June of 24, and he said the four oblasts, which are already part of the territory under our constitution, which have had the, if you like, the referenda, they wanted to join Russia. This is the minimum. And here is, if you like, here is Kellogg coming out and driving a horse and cart through the whole of the process and saying, I don't believe this will be acceptable to the Ukrainians. Well, of course, it's not acceptable to the Ukrainians, and it's not acceptable, what Witkoff was saying is not acceptable to the Europeans. They don't want it either. And so it was setting Trump up for a big clash. And already you can see the result of that is the talks are in trouble.
Okay, so the four oblasts, of course, are Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. The Russians have control of most of the land of those oblasts, okay, at this point. There are parts of Zaporozhye it doesn't have good control of yet, and some, of Kherson as well. But almost the whole of Donetsk, okay, and Luhansk, those oblasts, by plebiscite, have been made a part of Russia. Constitutionally, they're a part of Russia. Russia is never going to give them up. Furthermore, Russia fought this war in Ukraine for the purpose of negotiating. They had three goals. They wanted to demilitarize Ukraine. They wanted to denazify the regime, in Ukraine. And they wanted to neutralize Ukraine. What Kellogg was suggesting was a splitting up, of Ukraine and a Ukraine successor state that would be defended by NATO troops. But Russia fought this war for the purpose of having a neutral state between them, and NATO. If they wanted a border with NATO, what they would do is conquer the whole of Ukraine and have the border at the Polish border and the Romanian border and other borders. But Russia doesn't want that. That's not why they fought this war. They wanted a buffer state and still do in between them. Now you may say, well, Ukraine doesn't want that. My response to you on that is, it's too bad, because Russia is winning this war. And if they don't get what they want, with basically peaceful means, then they're going to get what they want through the actions of their military. And they're mobilizing the military to do that right now. And the more the U.S. is intransigent, the more they're going to mobilize and complete their conquest of Ukraine.
Because unless Trump comes down on one side or another, and he says, I back Witkoff, I don't know what happened in Witkoff's last thing, or if he says he backs Kellogg, he has a potential split in his group. And it's like contagion, because that is the last thing he needs, when what he wants, as I said, is to keep everyone supporting his trade, his tariff policy, his devaluation of the dollar policy. All of this is absolutely central to what Trump needs, because he wants a normalization. But he's got to keep his team, which involves a lot of people. They were already unhappy with Witkoff, many of them saying there was a complaint made to Walz by many, particularly in the Senate, saying he leans too far to Russia. He leans too far. He's too far gone. We can't allow this to go on. We must stop this, and we must prevent it. And this is a...
Why does he lean too far? Because Trump has instructed him to make peace with Russia. Trump wants peace with Russia. He wants a peace agreement. And the Russians outlined from the beginning what their ideas of a peace agreement should look like. It was part of their conditions for negotiation. If Witkoff wasn't willing to entertain them, even the first talks with Moscow wouldn't have started.
Real problem for of course, for Trump.
Yeah.
But imagine the consequences of that, because he's got to keep his support base there. They stood with him during the crisis. They're a little unhappy. They're very unhappy with Witkoff and what's happening there. I mean, this faction, not all of the Republicans, but this faction. And then there are the talks in Iran. And what is the connection between that is, if you look at keeping the team together, 90% of the team are Israeli firsters. They're all extreme. I don't know what was the sort of Faustian bargain, but Trump did a deal with the most nationalist, with the, if you like, the hard people on Israel. So if
he did that kind of deal in return for lots of money from donors who were big supporters of Israel. Chief among these was Adelson, Miriam Adelson, who gave Trump $100 million for his campaign. The only one who gave more money was Elon Musk. Trump meant to pay them off by surrounding himself with Zionists. But how could he expect he was going to be able to make peace with Russia by surrounding himself with Zionists? What was he thinking? He needed, and he needs, people who are realistic about West Asia and how things have to be settled in West Asia. And being realistic does not mean supporting the vision of greater Israel that's being put forward by Netanyahu and the Israelis. Realism means something else. It means the Palestinians have to have something. And that's exactly what these donors don't want to accept. And exactly what the Zionists Trump has surrounded himself with don't want to accept.
He's going to keep his team together. You know, maybe the only thing is to give up Iran to them, to keep the team together because of the economic program being his signature program, and it's not going that easily.
He cannot give up Iran to them, because if he gives up Iran to them, if he bombs Iran and he starts a war with Iran, then the Russians are out and they will not make peace with him. And he won't be able to get that peace going. And he won't be able to get out of Europe. And he won't even be able to finish Iran off because they're too strong. He'll be mired in Iran. He'll be mired in Europe. And he won't be able to turn towards China, which is what he wants to do.
There's chaos and there is a lot of unhappiness. So Iran is how many, it's quite different. There is a constituency in the Republicans that wants to see, the Ukraine war end and finish, even if the neocons don't. But the numbers of people who really, ordinary Americans would say, oh, well, we agree, Iran mustn't have a nuclear weapon. Most would go along with that. So, that'll be a price, maybe the price that will be paid. And certainly, if we find, as I somewhat expect, Witkoff comes back from Tehran and says, oh, the Iranians are putting forward a plan whereby they will reduce the amount of enriched uranium and they will allow inspections and they give undertakings that they won't go towards weaponization. And many of his own team, Trump's own team, will say, well, look, this is just a runaround to the same old bad deal that we had that you got.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
Got rid of in 2018. It's the same deal. What's different? Nothing's different with that. We want something more than that. And either it's got to be a Libya solution where we go in and we blow up the whole of the infrastructure of Iran, or we end up having to go to war with Iran. So it's
a lot
very
to unpack here. Let me stop you, Alistair. There's a lot No. It's a brilliant analysis. There's a lot to unpack here. I don't think the Trump people realize that the bond market would give them the problems that it did. The United States government cannot operate without people lending money to it, called purchase.
Okay, that's false. In other words, these people don't have exposure to MMT. They don't understand that the government can perfectly well operate without issuing any debt instruments. It is not a problem. The need for debt instruments is not written into the Constitution. It is not written into law. We issue debt instruments right now when we have deficits because that's what we have always done. It's a hangover from gold standard days. It's been obsolete since 1971. There is no need to issue debt instruments to fund any deficits. Congress can order the Federal Reserve to create the money to cover any deficits. The 1996 Corn Law has been passed. Platinum coins can be minted to handle deficits of any size.
Purchasing bonds, the bond yield went up to 4.5%. As the current bonds out there are $31 trillion worth, are retired and rolled over. They draw the higher interest rate. The government doesn't even have the money to pay the interest on the bonds if they continue to go up. Trump's people,
they don't have to roll over the bonds that are falling due. They can use the proceeds from a platinum coin, which is minted and deposited in the Public Enterprise Fund account, at the New York Fed. They can use the seigniorage to pay the principal and interest on all the bonds that are falling due when they fall due. Okay.
didn't think of that. As for Iran, I mean, why would Iran ever accept the Libya solution? They, I would think, would rather go down fighting than allow the Americans and the Israelis to come in and dismantle them and emasculate them and effectively destroy their sovereignty. Don't you agree?
Yes, it would be the end of Iran in the way that we've seen the end of Syria. I mean, it would be such a humiliation that I think then it would be a sort of a form of Syria situation could take place. No, they'll never accept that. They'd never accept to be so humiliated that they risk the whole republic.
Okay.
Back to Netanyahu. What kind of trouble?
Okay, that's it. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover with that. But I did want to say that there are not only two alternatives here. There's not simply the alternative to go back to JCPOA and not go forward with the bombing of Iran. Those are not the only two alternatives. There's another alternative, which Larry mentions, where there could be a JCPOA 2.0, which includes more than the original JCPOA. It can't include more when it comes to the defense of Iran. The missiles will have to stay in place, and Iran's support for the resistance would also have to stay in place. They're not going to back off that. But perhaps whatever holes exist in the inspection scheme, perhaps tighter inspection schemes, perhaps face-saving changes to JCPOA 1 included in JCPOA 2 would give Trump a basis for declaring victory and backing off his threat to attack Iran. Why would he want to do that? There are some good reasons. First, he wants to have his peace with Russia. And secondly, he also wants to avoid a war in West Asia if he possibly can. Why does he want to avoid a war? Well, lots of the hawks in his administration want nothing more than a war. But Trump has seen what the U.S. military has been able to do to the Houthis. He's seen that now. It hasn't been able to stop the Houthis. Trump has now talked to Putin, and Witkoff has talked to Putin. I'm sure the Iranians have talked to Putin as well and have given him their view of the capabilities of the Israelis to attack the Iranian air defenses, which, by the way, are much improved since the Israelis failed in their attack on October 26th. It's been roughly 6 months now since that attack. And that's 6 months in which the Iranians have been acquiring planes, air defense systems from Russia, refining their own air defense systems, and developing their own missile stocks further. And here is Dee. Hello, Dee.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. I guess you couldn't make it to the 8 o'clock starting time.
I didn't realize it till now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I sent you a note about that, but
Yeah, you did. You did send a message. I just saw the messenger now where it had the streamline. I only looked at it from the YouTube thing, and I just kind of assumed it was 9 o'clock.
no, I had to schedule it from 8 to 11 because tomorrow we have a jewelry show here in the building, and I got to get up at 7 o'clock.
Right, and I shared the show on Facebook and I put it at 9 o'clock in the headings.
Oh, great. Okay, well, that's okay. It's, the luck of the draw. Okay, as we say.
Yes.
Anyway, we've been going through the first thing on the agenda, which is the Trump-Iran situation. And I'm just sort of finishing that up. I went through an article from Larry Johnson.
Okay.
And I went through about maybe 14 minutes of a video from Alistair Crook, okay, and the judge, okay, and commented on all that. And so that's where we are now. And in just about a minute, we'll be going over to talk tariffs again. We have a number of posts, okay, on tariffs.
Okay, and I'll start sharing around.
Okay, thank you. That will be a big help. Okay, as I was saying, okay, in finishing up, so Trump has seen the success or lack of it of the naval forces of the U.S. in trying to attack the Houthis and stop them. And they have had a singular lack of success. And as I said before, it's also true that the Houthis have sank some of the naval vessels of the United States. Details are not available, but Trump has admitted some warships have been sunk. And the Houthis, by the way, are just getting started. They haven't scratched the surface of their capabilities yet.
Mm.
Okay. But also Trump must be in the process of hearing either indirectly or directly the claims of Iran of what their capabilities are with respect to air defense and with respect to their ability to counter the B-2s and B-52s, and also to stop the Israeli Air Force from getting into Iranian airspace. And while, of course, I'm sure Trump and Witkoff are going to take these claims with a grain of salt, there's a sufficient amount of evidence to give them some credibility if that evidence is presented to Witkoff and to Trump by the Iranians and by Putin. I said before, I mentioned that Putin had met with Witkoff last Saturday. I'm sorry, it wasn't last Saturday. He was talking to the Iranians on Saturday, but on Friday he met with Putin, or maybe Thursday it was, I'm not sure the day, for 5 hours. They talked about a lot of things, went beyond the war in Ukraine, and went beyond the considerations of West Asia. They were talking business a lot. But I'm sure that Putin was introducing to Witkoff the facts of life about what's really going on in Iran, and also telling him what he knows about the air defenses of the Iranians, which the Russians have been strengthening now for some time. Witkoff's going to carry that back to Trump. And Trump doesn't really know about what the air defenses of Iran are like. And he's not getting much information about that from his so-called advisors, who seem to know less than nothing about a variety of things. So I'm sure Trump is a little fearful of any possible attack on Iran and is looking for ways to avoid it. So let's hope that Witkoff and Putin can combine, and the Iranians can combine, to give him reasons why he should be avoiding such an attack.
Yeah. One of the Israeli newspapers had said that that one of Witkoff's demands is for Iran to denuclearize. Now, Iran doesn't have the nuclear weapons, and they've passed every inspection.
Yes.
So I don't know if Israel is just selling that to its audience.
I think they're selling that to the audience. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be a problem, because Trump is going to be able to claim credit for, denuclearizing them, because they have yet to nuclearize.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're prepared to compromise on issues of enrichment, if that's the price of making an agreement with Trump. The price they'll exact from Trump for agreements of that kind is the end of sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
And if Trump tries to go back on the agreement again, then they're immediately going to nuclearize to the edge of getting a nuclear weapon, because that's the way they can retaliate, against it. So it's kind of a self-enforcing agreement. If Trump gets them to denuclearize down to enrichment of 20%, let's say, he can claim that that's a victory, but he'll have to keep the agreement unless he wants them to go right up to 61% again,
Mm-hmm.
which they're perfectly capable of doing, and they won't be able to stop that. So I think there's a potential for agreement there that would be face-saving for Trump. But I think that's all he can get. And I think he won't give up the possibility of peace with Russia in order to get any more than that from the Iranians. That may make some people in Congress very unhappy, but it'll make some people in Congress very happy. It's going to make the Israeli government very, very unhappy. But who knows how long that government's going to survive?
Mm-hmm.
I understand there's huge order in their streets as we speak. And there's been a tremendous escalation in the physical opposition that he faces.
Mm-hmm.
We may be seeing the fall of the Israeli regime in a few days.
That's true.
And that will really, really change the situation with respect to the pressure on Trump to attack Iran. So maybe we'll see substantial differences.
We could hope. That's all we could do is hope.
We can hope. Okay, we've got 4 things left for tonight. Okay, we have
Olive. Wait a second.
okay. We have a piece, by Bob Hockett, on what do and what kinds of tariffs make sense.
Well, I've got the music going here for a little bit. They've decided to sing.
Okay, okay. So you want me to do that one? I'll do that one. And then if they stop singing, there's a piece by Mike.
Okay,
Whitney.
I'll do the. Yeah, I'll do. Yeah, you do one, then I'll do one.
Okay, good. Okay, here we go then. So, the next piece is by Bob Hockett. Bob is a university professor of law at Cornell, in their law school. He is very, very brilliant. As you'll see from this particular post, he's one of the best thinkers in the social sciences, and particularly the interface between law and the social sciences that we have in this country. He disagrees with me a bit about when it comes to tariffs, but his ideas are very, very good, and I'm pleased to present them to you now. When do and what kinds of tariffs make sense? This is by Robert Hockett on April 11th, 2025. Here's a picture of what looks like a Chinese jug to me. I don't know if that's a picture of a Chinese jug, but it may be. Introduction. Mr. Trump's norm-busting, quote-unquote, ways are to be credited for helping at long last to get past our nation's suicidal taboo against tariffs. But that is, alas, the most we can say for Trump now. For the way he's now, quote, doing, unquote, tariffs is nothing short of moronic, which will both catastrophically damage us and discredit good trade policy for decades to come. Let's start with the familiar argument against tariffs. then turn to how smart trade policy flows directly from that argument's principal idiocies. Next section is called Ricardian imbecility. Bonnie says, what's that?
Yeah.
We will see as we read through it. The standard argument proceeds from the old Ricardian notion of, quote, comparative advantage, quote unquote. In essence, the idea is that if country A is better than country B at producing both wine and will, say, but is more better at the wine than the will, then it should do wine while B does the will, and then they should both trade. That way, you see, aggregate production by A and B combined is maximized, while trade takes care of the distribution of proceeds. I have to say here that I've presented the Ricardian idea of comparative advantage, as well. And I thought I did a pretty good job of it in my book on who needs balanced trade and who needs balanced budgets. But Bob's presentation here in this paragraph is so simple and so commonsensical that I prefer this formulation of comparative advantage to mine by quite a good deal, and it has the advantage of brevity. But anyway, going on. In essence, this is simply a variation on Adam Smith's and other old-time political economists' brief for the division of labor and the productivity gains wrought by the specialization that it enables. But hold on for a minute. Where do Smithian specialization and Ricardian comparative advantage come from? Well, were we to combine ourselves to Ricardo's examples, I think he's meant to say confine here, confine ourselves to Ricardo's examples, literally the wine and wool mentioned above, you might think in a matter of, quote, nature, unquote, of fate. Of course, Portugal's better at wine, while England is better at wool. You will reckon, just look at the weather. The problem with this idea at present, of course, is that with each passing decade since Ricardo's early 19th century, the role played by weather topography, by nature, in determining who's best at what has inexorably shrunken. As tech and manufacturing industry grow, agriculture and tourism shrink in proportional terms. Comparative advantage accordingly becomes choice, not fate. Well put, I think, by Bob. Had China listened to David Ricardo, it would be little more than the world's largest grower of rice. And had Alexander Hamilton listened to Ricardo's predecessors, principally Smith, who had argued the same thing, the U.S. would still be an economic colony of the U.K., sending it unfinished inputs for use in its factories, which of course were chosen and built, not a God-given, advantage. The fact that comparative advantage is actively chosen and built, not passively received, is what renders all Ricardian arguments heard since Hamilton's late 18th century, and especially those made by sociopath charlatans like Larry Summers and his former Clinton-era colleagues to this very day, so idiotic and so insidious. For they amount in such circumstances to demands we stay backward. In principle, they're no different from the arguments of old white men a century ago telling you why women and Black Americans shouldn't vote. Namely, because they were not yet experienced in matters of public policy. Smart tariffs. Three apposite circumstances. What shows latter-day Ricardianism to be idiotic, quote, imbecilic, unquote, in Hamilton's rendering, also shows where to use tariffs. In short, we should use them anytime and place that the temporary cost that is briefly diminished aggregate global production is outweighed by the benefits, including longer-term productivity benefits that well-designed such tariffs can bring. What specifically does this mean for the U.S. right now? Well, in essence, it means that three circumstances can well justify tariffs. One, first, national security. First, if you are reliant on a present or potential adversary, or on readily interrupted global supply chains for strategically critical finished products or materials, the use of tariffs are to shield your own budding capacities while they develop or to interdict possible contamination, quote unquote, by the adversary of your supplies can be well worth the cost. By the way, I have to remark here that today there broke news that China has said that it's shutting down its export business of supplies to Boeing. This is very important because much of the supplies that go into the manufacture of Boeing's planes are sourced from China. Now, from a national security standpoint, I have to ask you, how did we ever allow that situation to develop? What low-grade idiots allowed that situation to develop? Allowed Boeing to rely on supply chains in which China had a critical place? How did that ever make sense other than for increasing profits of Boeing? Anyway, if national security is a justification for tariffing China now, I really don't see it, because Boeing has to rely on China for certain supplies, and if we tariff China with respect to those products that Boeing relies upon, then we're going to have to get Boeing to produce those things itself, and to do so in a sufficient amount of time that it can survive as a company. Now, if we can do that with subsidies, that's fine. But if we can't, we're not going to be able to tariff China with respect to those products that are so important for Boeing. We'll probably have to wait for a while, maybe for a year or two, before we can get Boeing to manufacture those things itself, in this country. But certainly subsidies are going to be necessary, even though Boeing's not an infant industry. Going on to number 2 here. Infant industries. Second, and generalizing a national security reason. If you decide there are other less security-rooted reasons to develop domestic capacity in some industry or industries, tariffs, again, can quite usefully shield your own nascent producers from, quote, dumping, unquote, death at the hands of foreign incumbents until such time as they're able to fend for themselves. Well, I can agree with that, but there I always raise the possibility, wouldn't it just be more effective to subsidize the infant industry to protect them from dumping death at the hands of foreign incumbents? If you give them enough money, they can sell their new products, competing with the Chinese products, at the same price as the Chinese products. Subsidies is something we can easily do because we're a monetary sovereign. We can give them the money they need so they can price their products cheaply enough to compete with the Chinese or any other foreign incumbents for that matter. 3, domestic labor and environmental standards. And finally, if free trade means backtracking on hard-won domestic labor and environmental protections to compete with filthy slave labor jurisdictions of global markets, tariffs are not only well advised, but are a moral imperative. It is literally evil not to impose them in order to preserve those earlier made gains. Here, I don't know how subsidies, would work out. But it seems to me if you have competitive industries here, you can subsidize them enough to allow them to compete with filthy slave labor jurisdictions on global markets. So it seems to me that subsidies would be just as moral as tariffs. And we, of course, can well afford them again because we're a monetarily sovereign nation. Now, note what reasons 1 through 3 tell us about Mr. Trump's recent tariff proposals, starting with countries rather than products. Peer nations like Canada, Europe, Japan, well, Europe's not a nation, of course, would not seem to implicate any of the 3 reasons. None are adversaries. None possess industries that we lack and seek now to start, and all have much higher labor and environmental protections than we have. All 3 are accordingly fine friends for purposes of friend shoring. The best means of maximizing Ricardo-friendly transnational production without incurring the unacceptable costs represented by items 1 through 3. I agree with that. But right now, of course, under Trump, we are pissing off all of these nations, charging them tariffs when we certainly should not be. Well, does that mean that we eternally keep them as friends? Well, I certainly do think we should eternally keep Canada as a friend. I feel the same way when it comes to Mexico. I think Bob has opinions which are a little different from mine, when it comes to Mexico, but I feel the same way when it comes to Mexico. As far as Europe is concerned, and Japan, I don't have any objection to friend shoring things in these nations also. Though maybe Japan's degree of friendship with ourselves may change over a period of time, since their main market is China. So that may change. But that change will probably be gradual. And as we see it happening, we can cease to friend shore certain products from them. Again, I think subsidies here, in the context of friend shoring that's changing over time, I think subsidies would be much more useful than tariffs, especially in the context of gradual change. But going on, aspiring peer nations like Mexico or Vietnam next represent a more middling case. They do not implicate reasons 1 or 2 for tariffs, but they definitely implicate reason 3. Yes, they do. Moreover, and insofar as they serve as conduits for exports from adversary nations, they can indirectly implicate reasons 1 and 2 as well. I think the threat of that, of course, in Vietnam, I think, is greater than for Mexico. I think we can certainly deal with Mexico, though, without actually tariffing them. But maybe we can't. I don't know. My mind is open. I wish Bob was here to discuss this with him. He would defend his position on this brilliantly, I'm sure. But I believe that in both cases, that subsidies to create industries of our own, where we lack those, where reasons 1 or 2 come into play, or even where it's only reason 3 coming into play, that probably subsidies are the way to go, because receiving competition from companies here that we subsidized might improve labor standards and environmental standards in Mexico over time as they compete with us. I think we should work to collaborate with Mexico to make them a peer nation with ourselves completely, so we won't have trouble importing things from them on grounds of labor and environmental protections. Finally, bona fide adversary nations, as Trump self-fulfillingly prophetically portrays China as being, and nations that are ahead of us in some desirable industries, EVs, solar power, battery tech, etc., as China really is, can implicate reasons 1 and 2 respectively. Now, have you seen any analysis along these lines in the Trump White House's proposed plans or justificatory rhetoric around tariffs? Didn't think so, says Bob. And then he says, smart tariffs, 3 requisite complements. But now note what else is missing from Team Trump's planning, if we can call it that, in rhetoric. There is not only nothing on, there is actual hostility to the necessary complements required to enable tariffs to work. What do I mean by that? Well, remind yourself of the purpose of tariffs. They are to shield nascent domestic capacity till such time as it no longer requires protection. But this means we minimize the costs of tariffs only by maximizing the speed at which we jumpstart domestic capacity. And this too requires concerted collective action. There are 3 types of such action, each with its own reasons. And in any of this, I quite agree with what Bob is saying. 1, targeted national investment. First, targeted public investment to speed up development of new industries typically is needed. The reason is obvious. Private capital can earn a far quicker buck betting on price movements in secondary, financially, and tertiary derivative markets than on new primary good markets. Such are the wages of decades of, quote, financialization, unquote, which now assure you that the human lifespan limited time horizons of individual investors will channel finance capital to speculation, not production. Only the effectively perpetual lifespan nation has the right time horizon to optimize productive investment. Well, what I have to say about this is I entirely agree, but I also want to point out that China is a great example of this truth. China and the Communist Party within it have been directing national investment with a long time horizon in mind. And they've been doing this very effectively, at least since the 1990s. And that accounts for their absolutely astronomical growth rates since that time and the enormous progress they've made till today and are still making. They're using the time horizon of their nation to optimize productive investment by their nation and by the capitalists within it. They're directing the capitalist investments towards the industries they want those investments to go. They're picking winners and losers. And they're doing it from the standpoint of a national time horizon. That is very important. Guaranteed procurement. Second, ex-ante guaranteed procurement of new production at the front end of a new industry's lifespan also is typically needed. Right. The front end costs of starting a new industry from scratch are sufficiently high that with at least some degree of confidence that there will be an actual market for new production, such as can enable cost recruitment, the risk adverse will not dare to trend into the new field. Yes, absolutely. Guaranteed procurement is absolutely essential. These are the tools that he's talking about here. These are the tools of industrial policy. Number 3, national coordination, quote, industrial clustering. Finally, third, some degree of coordination of nationwide development by the entity with the widest jurisdiction. That would be our federal government, says Bob, also is typically needed, at least in massive redevelopment or mobilization projects like the World War I and II mobilizations. Only that way do you get the, quote, industrial clusters, unquote, that enabled the mobilization miracles achieved by the U.S. in the 20th century and China in the present century. For no private sector firm has the authority, nor do we wish it to ensure that where new factories are built, so are new neighborhoods, roads, power lines, schools, hospitals, and the like for the new workforces that will man them. Regrettably, the Trump types don't seem to get this, quote unquote, this. Hence, their tariffing will likely not bring domestic production online quickly enough to substitute for foreign imports and thus circumvent inflation. Their tariffs will function more like the 1970s oil embargoes than like the Hamiltonian, Lincolnian, Wilsonian, and Rooseveltian development miracles that we worked in the past. But wait, there's more. China-geddon. That's the title of his next section. I want to close this particular meditation with a bit more detail on just how idiotically, in light of the foregoing observations, the Trump people are handling even the one country in connection with which some sort of tariffs would for the non seem advisable, China. So not first, that to get tariffs right, you must target not only the right countries as described above, but the right products. China is certainly the right country in some ways that, say, Canada and Europe are not. But what are the products? For Trump, it's all of them, simply all of them. That is insane. There are at least 2 reasons. One, first, does the U.S. really need or even want to produce everything domestically that we now import from China, even clothing, Chinese vegetables, and cheap plastic toys? Trump shows no signs of even having posed himself this query. That is bizarre. For the more things you target, the more things you will have to develop domestic capacities on, and that is both costly and logistically taxing. 2, second, inasmuch as many imports from China are crucial imports to U.S. production itself, does Trump have a plan in place for rapid substitution? Again, he shows no sign of even having asked himself the question. For example, does Trump have a plan in place to substitute those products Boeing was getting from China so it can continue to manufacture in the face of China's newest policy not to ship those goods to Boeing? Meanwhile, and relatedly, as noted above, the fool is continually denouncing strategic public investment, procurement, and coordination. The latter, again, being that which gives you the industrial closest that A. Wilson and FDR invented to win World War I and World War II. B. We now have only one of in Silicon Valley, and C. China has thousands of everywhere. Hence, it is virtually certain that the answer to the query in 2, that query that ended with, does Trump have a plan in place for rapid substitution? That the answer to the query in 2 above is no. Now consider what this means. It means all these vital inputs that we get from China, which again are not unlike what petroleum was in the 1970s, will be shooting up in price overnight. And since we have no plan or means to substitute for them, again like oil in the 70s, it means welcome back 70s stagflation. A smart tariff policy on China would have had plans in place, plans for jump-starting domestic capacity and or friend sourcing before declaring trade war. But that would have meant strategic thinking, executing, and friend-making or keeping. Trump seems incapable of any of this. Even animals prepare for winter. Even animals plan. Not Trump. He is below human and even below non-human animals where strategy is concerned. He is more like a deciduous plant, defenseless against existential change, even when he is the cause of that change. A child with matches and no water hose. Conclusion. And this is a shame, for as noted above, it will not only destroy what little health now remains in our national productive and distributive capacities, but will also discredit the very policies we shall soon need to undo the damage. Congress, your move. Save this fool from himself and save us as well. Says Bob Hockett. I think you'll agree with me, even though I've critiqued this piece in some parts. I think you'll agree with me about the overriding brilliance of this post. It is a gem, and you ought to keep it around. Along, of course, with my recent paper on tariffs. Anyway, I'm afraid I don't see many comments other than the hellos. I'm sorry to see that. We do have nearly 40 people here now. I'm going to go to the next piece. Putting it up.
Okay.
Okay, are you ready to go, Dee?
Yes.
Okay. So here's the piece. It is a Mike Whitney piece. Okay, it's another great piece. I think I'm sharing the wrong thing. Sorry about that. I will try again. Oh, I see. I just clicked on the wrong thing. They were right next to each other. So here it is.
Okay, let me make this bigger here. Okay. Trump used emergency powers to impose his tariffs. Should we be concerned? Mike Whitney, April 13th, 2025. Trump did not fully usurp dictatorial powers to impose his tariffs. However, his actions, particularly his use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, and other emergency powers have raised significant concerns among critics, legal scholars, and some members of Congress that he is pushing the boundaries of executive authority in ways that could be seen as authoritarian or dictatorial. Rock.
Yes, this is again from Grok. I think it's actually Grok 3.
Okay.
The AI that is produced by Tesla. It's Tesla's AI, Grok 3.
Okay.
Okay, so this is Elon Musk. Elon Musk's AI is critiquing Trump in this paragraph. Please keep that in mind.
Okay.
Please go on.
Trump did not fully assert dictatorial powers to impose his tariffs. However, his act.
You read that already.
Oh, okay.
You're at Meet
Yeah.
the New Boss.
Okay. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. We just learned that the world's most powerful person, Donald J. Trump, has a boss, the bond market.
Yeah. Okay, but as I said earlier, the bond market didn't have to be his boss. He just didn't know how to control the bond market. He could have called up some of the MMT economists, though, and found out how.
He may not have acknowledged this to himself, but the global financial turmoil or tumult he caused has locked him in a fiscal prison. He is totally in hock to the goodwill of bond investors. He has also handed a loaded gun to his perceived enemy, China, and his supposed ally, Japan. The loaded guns they have are the more than $1 trillion of U.S. Treasuries, and China not much less. If they were to sell those bonds, or even if they chose not to refinance maturing bonds, that could be a disaster for Trump, because it could cause another potentially crippling spike in bond yields.
It could cause those if Trump did not know how to handle it.
Right, because they're slowly dropping the bonds.
Right, but even if they slowly dropping the bonds, the way to handle this and bring up a demand for bonds is to not issue any more bonds for a while.
Right.
Just use platinum coins and orders to the Federal Reserve from Congress to finance federal deficit spending. And the people wanting bonds will come crawling back. It's guaranteed they'll do anything to get their hands on U.S. Treasuries again in no time at all. Okay, please go on.
Okay. Here is the measure of Trump's debacle. He may well have trashed America's single most important financial competitive advantage, namely that investors have traditionally bought the dollar and U.S. Treasuries at a time of economic and political uncertainty. No more, because he personally has become the world's source of economic uncertainty and anxiety. So, as I say, he is now in a fiscal prison. And if bond investors, including Japan and China, see him imposing tariffs or cutting taxes in ways they don't like, they have the means and power to stop him.
Yes, but only if he doesn't find out how to handle the vigilantes. Okay, the bond vigilantes don't have any power over a president and a Treasury Secretary and a Federal Reserve Chair who know how to handle them.
Mm-hmm.
Please go on.
U.S. yields and dollar have parted company. Raising U.S. yields typically supports the dollar, as do geopolitical tensions, as the dollar is often seen as a haven asset. Since Donald J. Trump unleashed his trade war, however, U.S. yields have soared and the dollar has plunged. The
Yes,
dollar usually moves in lockstep with U.S. yields until Liberation Day.
Yeah, if you see this graph, see, it's
It's
always
crazy.
lockstep. Okay, until just now, at the very
Yeah.
end,
Yeah.
the dollar going down
One's going one way and one's going the other.
and yields going up. It's just for a short period of time we have this inversion, but it was Trump who caused it.
We have the market. We have markets responded so irrationally to Trump's Liberation Day announcement. Okay, why have the markets responded so radically to Trump's Liberation Day announcement? Investors don't like uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds fear, fear breeds panic, and panic breeds crash in markets. Trump's sudden imposition of sweeping tariffs triggered the fear that fundamental changes in global trade would produce higher inflation, slower growth, disrupted supply lines, and escalated conflict with American trading partners. These are the anticipated outcomes that put investors on edge and sent markets plunging. Trump has tried to ally investor fears by presenting his tariffs as an essential part of his America First policy. He's trying to convince, so he went too fast.
Sorry.
He is trying, to convince his supporters that these new duties will liberate working Americans from what Trump calls unfair trade practices. In a speech, he compared the tariffs to a declaration of economic independence, drawing parallels to other historic U.S. milestones. What can we extrapolate from this? First of all, that in Trump's mind, the United States has been the victim of abusive treatment by allies and rivals alike. As Trump puts it, they are ripping us off. This is the basic mindset that energizes Trump's Liberation Day philosophy, a philosophy that the rest of the world should be punished for America's deficit generating overconsumption and its 36 trillion ocean of red ink. This is everyone else's fault, not ours. And mainly it is China's fault because China opened its country to the voracious American corporations who moved their industries to take advantage of China's cheap labor. According to Trump, China should be blamed for that as well. The problem with America First economic policy is that other countries are going to defend their own economic interests too. So if someone like Trump tries to arbitrarily scrap the current systems of international trade and impose his own version, he is going to encounter stiff opposition, which he has. Even so, Trump's announcement has had a calamitous effect on the global financial system, triggering a convulsive flight from U.S. Treasuries. This, in turn, has prompted many analysts to speculate that Trump's trade war will fundamentally change the manner in which international trade is conducted. That, of course, has set off more alarms while ratcheting up investor anxiety to new highs, whatever. Singapore Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan summed it up like this. This is the end of an era. The architect, the master planner, the developer of the rule-based system of economic integration has decided that it now needs to engage in a full-scale demolition of the same system that it created. He's right, isn't he? The era of integrated markets and a globalized system is over. The world is being redivided into warring blocks by the administration that believes that the country that borrows and consumes more than any other country in the history of mankind is being unfairly exploited by low-paid workers around the planet. The idea is laughable.
Okay, so in my paper that I read last Saturday, I also took on the idea that other nations, okay, are ripping us off and explain why this idea is laughable, okay,
All
and
right.
it's true. But here, I think a really fundamental point is being made, and that is the world is being redivided, okay, into warring blocs.
Mm-hmm.
That is not at all to the advantage of the United States, because the way things are looking now, if the world redivides into warring blocs, we're going to be locked out, okay, of Eurasia, which is, and Africa, okay, as well. That means we'll be locked out of most, okay, of mankind. The way we're acting with the Europeans, we could well be locked out of there too.
Definitely.
And we have to take steps to bring the Canadians and the Mexicans aboard with us also, and treat all of the nations of Latin America in a much more friendly fashion, or we'll find them joining up with the other bloc, okay, as well, and we'll be totally isolated. But the idea of trying to divide the world into warring blocs is not what we need. What the people of this country needs is to be part of everything that is going on in the world. And that requires collaborating with all other nations that would like to collaborate with us. Anyway, going on.
Okay, according to Donald J. Trump, nobody is getting, quote, off the hook for the unfair trade balances and non-monetary tariff barriers that other countries have used against us, especially not China, which by far treats us the worst. There was no tariff, quote, exception announced on Friday. These products are subject to the existing 20% fentanyl tariffs, and they are just moving to a different tariff bucket. The fake news knows this, but refuses to report it. We are taking a look at semiconductors and the whole electronic supply chain in the upcoming national security tariff investigations. To fully grasp the extent to which Trump's underlying theory depends on the belief that, quote, they are ripping us off. We've excerpted the short clip from a post by Arnaud Bertrand commenting on a speech, and here it is. The gist of Moran's argument is to reposition the global reserve currency status of the dollar, not as an exorbitant privilege, but as somehow a, quote, burden that the rest of the world needs to compensate us, compensate the U.S. for bearing. As Marin explains it, having the dollar as a reserve currency has caused persistent currency distortions and contributed, along with other countries, unfair barriers to trade, to unsustainable trade deficits, which have disseminated our manufacturing sector. So he wants to give up the reserve currency status of the dollar, right? Wrong. He wants to have it both ways. He says that America's, quote, financial dominance cannot be taken for granted and that Trump administration is determined to preserve it, but this same financial dominance comes at a cost, and other nations need to pay for it. Let's pause for a moment here to contemplate the sheer insanity of this. The U.S. is literally suggesting that countries should mail checks to the U.S. Treasury as tribute for the privilege of maintaining the dollar as a global reserve currency, when it is this very reserve status of the dollar that is the cornerstone of U.S. power.
Yes, I think that's right. And this is a ridiculous idea. I will have more to say about the idea, okay, of the U.S. continuing to have the reserve currency. This week was a particularly good week for Bob Hockett. He wrote another great article on the reserve currency, and I'll be taking that up in my show on Saturday. So
Okay.
Just wanted to point out.
And I was going to say too, the power of the sanctions.
Yes,
The U.S.
yes, the power of the sanctions that we're constantly throwing, okay, at everybody. Okay, but okay, that doesn't mean that the reserve currency is not a burden. It's a burden on certain Americans, specifically those Americans that are priced out of employment due to the burden of the reserve currency. It does cost us about 1% or 1.5% of unemployment.
Okay,
That's real. Okay.
right.
Okay, please go on.
WTF? What the you know what? So, Moran thinks that overconsumption and deficit spending is so indispensable to the global economic system that other countries should pay the U.S. to continue its shameless freeloading. Indeed, this is his position, and the belief is not limited to Moran either. In fact, this is the ideological cornerstone upon which Trump's trade philosophy rests. We will spend, we will spend, you will pay. We will take, you will give. We will rule, you will follow. Get the picture? I think so. Oh, and just to add insult to injury, we also regard ourselves as the victim in this relationship. They're ripping us off. It boggles the mind.
This chart is, I'm not sure what this chart is showing. Oh, US dollar cash settlements, uh, cash settlements. I guess this is giving the USD daily value,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and it's showing that uh, okay, it's been much higher than it is now. You see points where it's 107.55, 105.96. This is the value of the dollar on the bond markets, I guess. 108.99, 107.61. Then it drops on March 17th to 103.24. Goes up to 104.55. I can't see what this other value is. It looks like, okay, it's about 103.52 or something like that. Then it drops precipitously. Its value now is at $99.81. Okay, which is the lowest price uh, of cash settlement, I guess, for bonds. Well, maybe it's for dollar currencies because this is a foreign exchange figure here. So, in other words, $100 exchange of $100 cash is being settled for less than $100 right now. That's incredible, especially compared to the rest of that graph. So Trump has collapsed the value of the dollar. Please go on.
Trump's whole scattershot approach to international trade speaks to the unbounded arrogance, and that appears to be the driving force behind it, behind Liberation Day. The immutable belief that the rest of the world exists only to serve U.S. interest. Am I wrong? I'm not wrong. Just look at the markets. Investors are voting with their feet. They're headed for the exits. Their panic is a referendum on Trump's trade policies. This is not a financial crisis. This is a tariff-induced run on U.S. risk assets that is attributable to one man alone, Donald J. Trump. No one else caused this. Trump's signature economic program, reciprocal tariffs, is based on the wrong-headed view that the rest of the world is supposed to function as America's personal ATM. But investors don't ascribe to this belief. They think the tariffs are going to trigger a fire sale of U.S. financial assets and crash the market. And that's what's plummeting Treasury market is telling us too. This is from an article at Politico. The sharp sell-off in government debt securities that underpin the global financial system pushed President Donald Trump to pause for 90 days his plan to slap punishing tariffs on dozens of trading partners. Investors often treat government bonds as a haven during times of market stress. Now the opposite has occurred. Hedge funds and other investors have dumped Treasury securities even as stocks plunged, pushing up yields that are used to benchmark everything from mortgage rates to corporate loans. The 90-day pause has done little to quell the market's fears. If trade policy uncertainty continues to rattle bond investors and drive up a harrowing borrowing cost, it would saddle Trump with a lethal mix of high interest rates, elevated inflation, and slower or even negative economic growth. There's little clarity right now on the extent to which bond market jitters are driven by general market turmoil. Some investors are selling treasuries because they need cash, or whether it might signal something more anonymous, such as less confidence in U.S. assets as Trump upends the global economic order. The fact that the dollar and the treasury bonds are sinking, even as stocks crater, reflects broader questions about who is going to finance continuous deficits. Where is the capital going to come from to support U.S. assets in general? Okay. And that was bond market motion sickness in Trump's economy, Politico. The situation is dire, which is why Trump threw in the towel and lifted the tariffs on 90 countries, excluding China. His plan is to use tariffs as a means of inflicting pain on trading partners, was derailed by an unexpected flight from U.S. debt that he never saw that coming. The incident speaks to the supreme importance of U.S. treasuries in the global system. The 28 trillion treasury market, which is the most liquid and well-capitalized market in the world, plays a special role in the global economy. The yields on the 10-year and 2-year notes serve as a benchmark for pricing other financial instruments worldwide, including corporate bonds, mortgages, and loans. When treasury yields rise or fall, they influence borrowing costs globally. In other words, U.S. Treasury yields, are you going too fast?
Okay, sorry.
Yields set the tone for global monetary conditions, and when the market becomes volatile, as it has following Trump's tariff fiasco, everything goes haywire. It's no overstatement to say the U.S. Treasury market is the cornerstone upon which Western style capitalism rests, and any cracks that appear in the foundation are likely to have catastrophic impact on the world economy. That is why Trump gave away quickly and eased the policy on everyone but China. China versus world manufacturing output. Yeah, China, 4.16 trillion.
Yep.
And then the combination of the others is 411 trillion. So,
And there's the United States down there at 2.49 trillion.
yeah. Yeah, China's industry makes up about 26% of the world's total industrial output in 2024.
Yes.
As for China, the economy is now effectively under a U.S. embargo that has been imposed willy-nilly without congressional approval and in clear violation of the World Trade Order rules. Here's a short blurb from Grok. The WTO sets out a framework for international trade, which includes the prohibition of arbitrary or unjustifiable trade barriers. Tariffs cannot be used to discriminate unfairly between trading partners. Trump's tariffs violate WTO rules as they appear to breach MFN, non-discrimination, and tariff-binding commitments without clear justification under WTO exceptions. The tariffs also lack sufficient justification under national security exceptions and are seen as discriminatory and protectionist. It is also worth noting that the countries that Trump has imposed tariffs on are being asked to align with U.S. national security goals. This is an issue that the media has failed to cover in any detail, but the implication is that the administration is using economic coercion to enlist an anti-China coalition that will join the United States in its effort to sanction, isolate, and encircle the People's Republic of China. Also, Trump has invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify his tariffs, including those announced as part of his Liberation Day policy and earlier actions, according to Grok. A White House fact sheet from April 2nd, 2025, states that Trump declared a national emergency due to foreign trade and economic practices, creating a threat to U.S. national and economic security, and it mentions using IEEPA to impose responsive tariffs to address the emergency. The IEEPA, enacted in 1977, allows the president to declare a national emergency in response to an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security, foreign policy, on the economy that originates outside the U.S. Once declared, the president can block transactions, regulate imports, exports, and take other economic measures. Conclusion? Yes, Trump has invoked the IEEPA to justify his tariffs, including those from the Liberation Day announcements on April 2nd, 2025, and earlier actions in February of 2025. He declared national emergencies under the IEEPA to impose both the baseline 10% tariff on all imports and the higher reciprocal tariffs, framing trade deficits and related issues as threats to U.S. economic and national security. Question: has Trump used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to avoid getting congressional approval for his trade policy? Yes, Trump has used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to avoid the need for congressional approval for his tariffs, including the Liberation Day tariffs and earlier 2025 actions, by declaring national emergencies related to trade deficits, drug trafficking, and migration. He claims unilateral authority under IEEPA to impose tariffs without legislative consent, exploiting the law's broad emergency powers. Question: does Congress have the legal authority to oversee the imposition of tariffs? Yes. Congress has the legal right to oversee the imposition of tariffs under the Constitution and federal law, Article 1, Section 8, as it holds the ultimate authority to regulate foreign commerce and impose duties. However, Trump's use of the IEEPA to declare national emergencies allows him to bypass this oversight temporarily, relying on broad executive powers that don't require congressional approval. Last question for Grok. What do we call a political leader who usurps Congress's legitimate constitutional authority and accrues all state powers to himself. A political leader who usurps congressional legitimate constitutional authority and accrues all state powers to himself is most commonly called an autocrat, dictator, or tyrant in extreme cases. For Trump specifically, the labels depend on perspective. Critics see his IEEPA use as authoritarian, while supporters see it as bold leadership. I blame Congress as much as Trump, but however you look at it, we're in uncharted waters. Crazy.
Okay.
I know. Totally crazy.
Okay, let us look at the comments about that. I don't know why this is not going back to baseline, but there it is. It's at baseline now. So we have Joe Logan here. Says, hello, people. Joe says, the whole government of America is the problem, not just Trump,
Hmm.
as well as the corporations who control government. If I win 200,000 in the lottery, I'm going to India. The U.S. dollar is worth 70 or more Indian dollars. So his 200,000 will be worth, what is it, 14 million? Michael Turning says, Joe Logan, but eggs. How much are eggs? Good question, Michael D. Turning. Okay, I thought that piece was excellent.
I did too. It's just,
It was crammed with facts, and the analysis was excellent. And his use of grok, I love his use of grok. Elon Musk's AI to discredit Trump. That's the irony of that is wonderful. Okay, so I like that. So we've had two fine analyses of the tariffs thus far. Okay, now let's go to a third one.
yeah, the dogs are snoring here. I'll have to put the mute button on.
Okay, good. So this one is from UNS as well, and the author is Pepe Escobar. And the title is Why China Won't Call a, quote, tariff-wielding barbarian, unquote. This is April 12th, 2025. It is relatively short, which is good since we are running behind a little bit. And there are the United States and China fighting over tariffs in this graphic. Three wise monkeys are perfectly aware of what a pigeon posing as an eagle is reeling up to. The toddler temper tantrum style Trump tariff tizzy, TTT. It looks to me like it's T, 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 T. Now accelerated to 145% and counting, is yet another thunderous trademark pigeon smashing the chessboard gambit. It won't work. Trump claimed that China would call him to, quote, make a deal, unquote. That's reality show territory. Reality is more like the statement by the Customs Tariff Commission of the State Council, given that U.S. exports to China already have no market acceptability under the current tariff rates. If the U.S. further imposes additional tariffs on Chinese goods, China will simply ignore them. Translation: keep vociferating, tariffing. We don't care, and we will stop buying from you anything. And that probably includes buying any more of our treasury debt instruments. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, quote, a tariff-wielding barbarian can never expect a call from China, unquote. Basic numbers. China's GDP for 2025 is projected at 5%. Is that the GDP? I think that must be the GDP increase for 2025 is projected at 5%. The U.S. imports account for at best 4% of Chinese GDP. China's share of total exports to the U.S. dropped to 13.4% in 2024. Goldman Sachs, not exactly a Chinese Communist Party mouthpiece, quote unquote, has just projected that TTT will cost China only 0.5% of GDP in 2025, while costing no less than 2% of US GDP. Talk about blowback. Still, from now on, what matters most for Beijing is to keep diversifying the supply chain. Asia-wide, the extra wheels are in motion. President Xi Jinping will soon start an ASEAN mini tour. Vietnam, Cambodia, also he's going to Malaysia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, increasingly focused on geoeconomics, is about to meet. The EU, for all the mendacity of its elites, is absolutely itching to strike trade deals with China. Zhao Minghao, deputy director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai, refers to the current incandescent as, quote, a game of strategic resolve. Previously, the eminent Wang Yiwei, international relations star professor at the Renmin University in Beijing, and an expert on the new Silk Roads, noted that the current tariff rate already made China's exports to the U.S., quote, almost impossible, unquote. This analysis noted how China started to deal with TTT with a, quote, courtesy before force, unquote, approach, then to turn to, quote, we don't care, unquote, while cultivating, quote, the art of timing, unquote, in its asymmetric attack on U.S. stocks. A fascinating window on the real wheels of Chinese trade is offered by a timely visit to the vast Yiwu International Trade City, the largest concentration of small traders on the planet. Less than 10% of Yiwu's phenomenal amount of business involves the U.S. Among the 75,000 business operators in Yiwu's small commodity city, only a little over 3,000 do business with the U.S. Two Sinophobes meet one one mirage. TTT is largely the product of two crude, Team Trump, arrogant / ignorant Sinophobes. Economic advisor Peter Navarro and the Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, who knows less than zero about all things China. In fact, it was Bessent who right at the start gave the game away. Quote, this was driven by the president's strategy. You might even say that he goaded China into a bad position. They responded. They have shown themselves to the world to be the bad actors. And we are willing to cooperate with our allies and with our trading partners who did not retaliate, unquote. A crude trap with the sole focus on China that has nothing to do with the initial tawdry plot line, tariffs, mafia style on most of the planet, penguins included. If you don't retaliate, fine. If you do, we hit harder. Of the so-called of the mirage, quote unquote, after Trump's alleged economic brain uh, uh, Stephen Moran. What is actually happening fast, bypassing the stupid notion of tariffs will be paid for by current depreciation elsewhere. See Moran's white paper here, is the uncontrolled demolition of the U.S. as a world trade center. Asked why he paused the tariffs, Trump answered, I thought people were jumping a bit out of line. They were getting a little bit yippy. They were getting afraid, unquote. Nonsense. Trump cannot possibly admit on the record that the U.S. oligarchy, Jamie Dimon and company, freaked out big time, and that, plus the debacle in the bond market, forced him to backtrack. Nobody in neoliberal heaven and earth can mess with the goddess of the market. As for the long-term strategy of several nations of the global majority caught in TTT's crossfire hurricane, not to mention big players like China and the EU, they will all avidly reduce their dependence on U.S. markets. Once again, the elaborate deal offered by China and his illiterate advisors boiled down to a mafioso, quote, offer you can't refuse. Blow up or significantly diminish your trade with China, the largest trading partner of nearly all of these nations, and trade with exceptional exceptionalistan plus 10% tariffs. To hell with your economic sovereignty and strategic flexibility. Once again, it's our way or the tariff highway. Reality instead will dictate that the U.S. will increasingly import Chinese products from third countries, while China will continue to get paid for it. China will export even more to ASEAN and other global majority actors. As it stands, Trump's plan, quote unquote, if there is any, remains to, quote, stabilize, unquote, his allies while concentrating all the firepower on China, in theory, to drive China's complex supply chains to chaos and force companies to move their production lines to, for example, Vietnam or India. Shakedown leading to breakdown. China containment will be on overdrive. Expect a tsunami of technological restrictions, investment red lines, and of course, extra sanctions. Sinophobe Besant does not rule out delisting Chinese stocks from U.S. exchanges. I think everything's on the table. That will be President Trump's decision, unquote. Beijing, for its part, can easily go nuclear, deciding for a sell-off of all its U.S. treasuries en masse, with catastrophic cascading consequences. As of January, Beijing held $760 billion U.S. debt with a delightful diplomatic touch. Yang Panpan and Xu Kuiyan, researchers at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, note that what happens next with U.S. Treasury bonds remains, quote, highly uncertain. A Bridgewater billionaire, Ray Dalio, for his part, while incisive, was also heavy on diplomacy. Quote, we are seeing a classic breakdown of the major monetary, political, and geopolitical orders. There's no more cooperative world order, quote unquote, led by the U.S. In fact, that was anything but cooperative, unquote. Dalio at least recognizes the unilateralism manifest in, quote, the U.S.-led trade war, geopolitical war, technology war, and in some cases, military wars, unquote. Chinese Foreign Ministry's spokesperson Lin Jian de facto synthesized Beijing's position. No more Mr. Nice Guy, which was the default Chinese position until recently. If the U.S. insists on fighting a tariff war and a trade war, China will fight to the end. And so here we are. It's the empire of chaos against BRICS. The empire of chaos embarks on a hot geoeconomics war against its peer competitor, China. Contemplates a hot sort of military war against sovereign Iran, and at the same time tries to appease nuclear hypersonic power Russia into a sort of hazy deal to somewhat freeze the forever war by proxy in Ukraine. The new Primakov triangle, RIC, as Russia, Iran, China, is perfectly aware of these moves. Putin had metaphorically characterized the Russian position in the US-China trade war when he mentioned the Chinese have a good proverb. When tigers fight in the valley, the smart monkey sits and watches how it ends. Now is more the case of three wise monkeys perfectly aware of what a pigeon posing as an eagle is really up to. Interesting metaphors there by Pepe, but certainly a very interesting characterization of what is going on and what is likely to happen, and of all the silliness that is characteristic of the Trump side. So we come now to a final piece of the night. Steve says, hello, everybody, again. Joe Logan says, Michelle deterring. Actually, it's Michael. Who cares? Laugh out loud. And Joe Logan says, you all understand that all the bullshit happening is a bullshit circle jerk for a reason to raise prices on everything. Look at this bird flu. How is it only affects chickens being sold to grocery stores? Doesn't affect any other birds, yet a flu is supposed to be contagious. I don't know much about the bird flu, Joe. I will leave the expertise there to you. But anyway,
It doesn't make sense, but
it does not make sense. But let us move to our final piece of the night, which is again on tariffs. And if you're ready, I think it's your turn, Dee.
okay.
Let me get to the beginning of this.
Oh, and here we are again.
Yes.
And the tide goes out. We know who is swimming naked. King Trump is the emperor with no clothes. Log in April 14th, 2025.
And there is Trump giving somebody the side eye.
Okay, when I wrote my last essay, China's strategy to defeat U.S. by bankrupting it, just before Trump's Liberation Day, I thought I would do a follow-up in a month's time after the dust settles down a little. Things have moved along the trajectory as predicted, but at a much faster pace than I anticipated. With the last Friday announcement that Trump is exempting China-made smartphones, chips, computers, and electronics from the 125% reciprocal, a complete farce, tariff, representing roughly a quarter of China's exports to the U.S., King Trump essentially bent his knees and capitulated. However, Caroline Leavitt spins it. Trump didn't just blink, he dodged. Anthony Blinken was right. In international relations, either you are on the table, you're either at the table, or you are on the menu. We have found out that Chicken Trump is on the menu alongside Chicken Kiev. I commented in the last essay, Trump's trade policy was like putting a gun to his own head to threaten the world. Little did I know he would put a razor on his throat with his own hand, and also ate some rat poison to go with it. Typically, I would draw conclusions after, quote, let the bullet fly a little longer. However, a few things are already clear since April 2nd, Fool's Day. We can anticipate what is likely to come in the coming months and years. In this essay, I will share my predictions I'll focus on the bigger picture and advice against being captive to the day-to-day, even hour-to-hour headlines that will surely come from the saturation media. On a follow-up essay to be published later, I'll share the lessons learned from events of the past week. So many myths are broken, and so many naked truths have come out when the tides go out. Okay. Here are my top line predictions. Trump has lost and will get little concession from China. Peel away all the theatrics of the last 2 weeks. It is clear the primary target of Trump's all-out tariff war is China. Unfortunately for him, like he said to Zelensky, Trump himself has no cards this time. The trade war happens at two levels, economic and political. On the economic level, U.S. is the third largest market for Chinese exports, after ASEAN and EU, accounting for 12.5%, 440 billion out of 3.5 trillion, down from 20% in 2018. The 440 billion U.S. export represents 2.3% of China's GDP, 19 trillion. China's trade with the U.S. has shrunk since 2018. Its trade with the rest of the world, Russia and Global South in general, has been growing rapidly. The U.S. is not that important, a market for Chinese goods already. For example, China doesn't export any EV to the U.S. 100% tariff thanks to Biden, and is still the world's #1 EV exporter. Even if trade with the U.S. goes to zero, China can make up the lost U.S. export by consuming more domestically and selling more to the rest of the world. The Chinese government has plenty of fiscal and monetary tools to stimulate consumption domestically. There are 3 trillion foreign reserve, including 760 billion U.S. Treasury and 13 trillion domestic savings. China's trade surplus, along with 1 trillion in 2024, a lot of these funds can be used to offset the negative impact of a trade war with the U.S. Digging a bit deeper, 90% of China's export to the U.S. is tech products, machinery, pharmaceuticals, batteries, green energy products, and critical minerals. Only 10% is low value added products, such as shoes, clothing, toys, and furniture. 30 to 40% of Chinese exports to the U.S. goes into the manufacturing process in the U.S. as parts and components. Given China's position on global supply chain, U.S. businesses and consumers will find it very difficult to replace Chinese goods economically, either directly or indirectly in trading with other countries. Otherwise, China's export to the U.S. would have become much lower by now after the 2018 Trump's first trade war. On the other hand, 70% of China's imports from the U.S. is agricultural and energy products that can be replaced with other suppliers in Brazil, China, and elsewhere. By 2022, the U.S. relied on China for 532 key product categories, nearly 4 times the level in 2000. While China reliance on U.S. products was cut by half in the same period, the U.S. relies almost exclusively on China for rare earth, for high-tech manufacturing, and for API, active pharmaceutical ingredients for drug production. 95% antibiotics used in the U.S. is produced in China. If cut off, the U.S. tech and pharma industries will suffer. The biggest reliance China had on the U.S. was semiconductors, but that trade has already been cut off by Biden's cheap embargo. In short, China simply has a much lower trade dependency on the U.S. than the other way around. At the big picture, China sits on top of the global supply chain as producer, and the U.S. is at the bottom as consumer. China can cause as much, if not more pain, on U.S. businesses and households. In addition, on the financial front, China can inflict enormous disruption on the U.S. economy if it decides to dump U.S. Treasury holdings, driving up borrowing costs for everyone in the U.S. This could deal a massive blow to the U.S. as the country is highly leveraged at every level from government, business to household. China, so far, has refrained from exercising the nuclear option. Oh, wait, you went too quick.
No, sorry.
The nuclear option, but it certainly is on the table if the economic war escalates. On the political level, the trade war between U.S. and China has become a contest of national resolve. It is part of the full spectrum U.S.-China confrontation. Xi has nearly universal domestic support to stand firm against Trump, whose trade war on China has turned into a mobilization call. Trump's total disrespect for U.S. trading partners, quote, kissing my ass, who are ready to negotiate like Vietnam and Japan, only serves to repulse the Chinese and make any concessions extremely distasteful. On the other side, the chaos in the U.S. financial markets, equity, bond, currency, and prospect of runaway inflation are leading to broad-based resentment of Trump's self-inflicted pains from billionaires to the working class. Even MAGA diehards are worrying about the impact on their wallets. King Trump has neither the political capital nor personal grit to stand firm. As Trump boasts of other nations kissing my ass, Xi is spanking his ass with pants down in front of the world. While Trump pathetically proclaimed Xi is my good friend, the affection is never reciprocated and treated with complete disdain by Beijing. Xi has not even mentioned Trump's name in public since April 2nd. As the most important goal of the trade war is to hurt China, China's tough stand has made Trump's whole tariff policy irrelevant and the butt of a bad joke. Trump will get some limited concessions from weak countries and vassal states and would declare a huge victory. As Trump crudely puts it, many countries have reached out to kiss my ass. Please, sir, please. No doubt he is bullshitting with the numbers. It was more than 50 countries, 70 countries, and then more than 75 countries. From one spokesman to another, still countries like Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, India, Canada, Mexico, etc. will kowtow to his coercion to various degrees. They will offer to lower tariffs, promise to buy some U.S. goods, and maybe invest in U.S. manufacturing or purchase more U.S. debt. Trump's blackmail will extract its pound of flesh from weak victims. However, he could have easily got those deals through bilateral negotiations, since many are vassal states with little agency, and without humiliating these trade partners. Instead, he chose to piss off everyone. Even those who indeed kick his ass don't like to be called out as such.
I think that's a misprint there.
Yeah, the kiss his ass.
Kisses.
Yeah. The economic trajectory of the U.S. will not change. With or without the reciprocal tariffs, the U.S. will not reindustrialize and bring manufacturing jobs back in any meaningful manner anytime soon. This is because the tariff policy will not address the root cause of U.S.'s economic problems today. Deindustrialization is a result of decades of financialization, profit-driven outsourcing, poor domestic infrastructure and education, overregulation, and shareholder first short-term focused neoliberal economic practices. Technological transformations like AI and automation further erode any prospect of bringing manufacturing jobs back. Today's U.S. is a high-cost economy. Its infrastructure from roads, bridges, ports to railways are crumbling, Are you going too quick?
Sorry.
Are crumbling and not capable to support large-scale industrial production. Its labor force is poorly skilled and not trained to carry out high-end, high-tech manufacturing. Starbucks coffee baristas and McDonald's burger flippers don't automatically make battery mechanics, and there won't be millions and millions of American workers putting tiny screws on iPhones like Lutnick very helpfully pontificated. Its managerial class is driven by quarterly earnings and repelled by long-term investment and risk-taking. Its ruling elite are financiers and lawyers, not engineers. They don't know how to build factories, develop supply chains, design and produce stuff, and manage a workforce. After all, it's so much easier to make money from the stock market or as talking heads on TV or as an online influencer. It's easier to study marketing or law than physics and engineering. The hard work of making things is no longer in the USA DNA. The cost of reindustrialization is simply too high in the many trillions, beyond a country already with 36 trillion national debt, not counting the many more trillions in business and household debt. Traditional safe havens such as U.S. Treasury and currency will crumble. De-dollarization will accelerate. Despite loudly threatening any country from de-dollarizing on his campaign trail, I'll put 100% tariff on anyone who don't want to use the US dollar. Trump has delivered the biggest gift to the proponents of de-dollarization. As a fiat currency, the entire value of the US dollar resides in the credibility of the issuer, the US government. Trump, the chaos agent, with his mood swings, incoherent ramblings, irrational decision making, and total lack of basic economic common sense, has managed to do the impossible, driving U.S. equity, bond, and currency down at the same time. The result of his crazy moves is higher borrowing costs, reduced investments, higher inflation, lower standard of living, and accelerated exodus from U.S. dollars by not just U.S. foes, but even its friends. Xi and Putin cannot do any of the above. Only King Trump can manage this, turning the U.S. into an economic terrorist rogue state. U.S. rivalry with China will be further militarized and a hot war is more likely than ever. After falling flat on its face with the trade war and tech war with China, the U.S. will further gear up for a military showdown. It is already increasing military spending to a historic $1 trillion per Hegseth. Refuse thank you, Mr. President Xi post. People say Trump is a peace president and doesn't like wars. I have never bought the crap for a second. If you've learned anything about him from his public behavior to shelves of books published by people who have interacted with him, you should know Donald Trump has zero moral compass, is a fraud, and a belligerent bully through and through. He is not a peacemaker. His actions in Yemen and threats against Iran are clear proof of that. It's a bygone conclusion. The number one U.S. regime priority is to weaken and destroy China by any means available. The only reason a hot war has not broken out is because the odds are against the U.S. military, and the U.S. regime still harbors the delusion to defeat China economically and technologically. However, as China's rise becomes unstoppable and all its cards are dealt and failed, the U.S. will resort to force. As with the trade war and tech war, China has long prepared for an eventual showdown in Western Pacific. Whether a hot war breaks out in Taiwan or South China Sea, whether it's a proxy war or a direct war, China will fight to the end and win. The race is on. Will the U.S. implode and go bankrupt first, or will a hot war break out between U.S. and China first? As laid out in my early essay, China's strategy to defeat the U.S. is to force it into bankruptcy before a hot war breaks out, much like the U.S. strategy that defeated the USSR. Trump's tariff war and Pentagon budget have accelerated the pace. The U.S. is facing higher borrowing costs, therefore interest payments, and higher military spending at the same time, the two single biggest expenditures for the U.S. government. You can also count on Trump following through with the Project 2025 neocon plan to cut taxes for his rich donors. Reducing revenue and increasing cost is a surefire way to go bankrupt, something Donald Trump has plenty of experience with. After all, this guy who went broke 6 times and somehow managed to bankrupt casinos. While China pursued the Sun Tzu art of war strategy to win without fighting, Trump pursues his fart of the deal to bluff and swindle. As I said last time, Trump is the best unpaid agent for proudly communist China. And that's what we've always noted with China.
Yes,
It's patient, it thinks.
yes. Or its leaders are patient,
Yes.
okay, and they think. And our leaders are impatient and they do not think.
Right. And they bully and they're loudmouths.
Yes, and this is especially true with the Trump administration. It was true to a great degree with the Biden administration. They didn't think very deeply about the foreign policy.
No, and Biden used to do that too, act like Mr. Tough Guy.
Yeah, I
It's like,
know.
it's like why?
I know. They all cultivated this tough guy thing. Clinton, George Bush, generally not Obama, but he gave into it from time to time also. Yeah, the tough guy image has been there for some time, and it's distorted foreign policy.
It is.
Our need to act that way. I thought the predictions here were pretty good. I think the weakness of the predictions come in with respect to forecasting the bankruptcy of the United States. I don't know what that means. Legally, the United States cannot go bankrupt. There's no provision, okay, for bankruptcy. Okay, if Wabin is trying to say that the currency will be without any value, I agree. If we pursue the course we're pursuing now, our currency could be worth a lot less in international trade, than it's worth now. But as far as the domestic value of our currency is concerned, as long as the government stays our government and is acknowledged as the government, and as long as we pay taxes, the value of the dollar for domestic purchases and domestic transactions will remain strong. As far as the size of the debt and the interest payments is concerned, well, as long as the debt and the interest payments are in US dollars, there'll never be any problem for the US to pay off the debt or to meet its payments. And if people around the world decide they don't want to buy any US debts anymore, so we're not able to roll over the debts, well, the government has ways of, creating the money to pay off all the debts as they fall due.
Mm-hmm.
And as this power continues to manifest itself, and other people see that we will always pay our debts according to what's mandated by the Constitution, then confidence in the US dollar, at least in a domestic arena, will stay strong. And among foreign traders, they will continue to see that the US does not welch on its debts. So I don't see this total collapse as coming about, at any time. I see more commonsensical things perhaps occurring, like uh, the way Trump treats other nations. We could alienate our friends and lose our customers through that kind of thing. And we could find, that we are isolated and that we cannot import uh, 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 various key products uh, that we need to import in order to maintain our prosperity. Now, I don't see a problem. There's a problem with respect to Chinese pharmaceutical goods and the Chinese perhaps withholding those from us. We could probably learn how to manufacture the pharmaceutical goods. I'm sure the knowledge to do that is here, and we could set up factories to do that in a relatively short time. I don't think that's a big thing. So if the pharmaceuticals get to be priced too high, as long as the government supports uh, the return of the pharmaceutical industry to the United States, we ought to be able to handle that one and to keep the prices of the pharmaceuticals perhaps lower than they are now, even. But, that remains to be seen. But insofar as people don't want to trade with us, uh, that will be an incentive to manufacture and make more here. And in the long run, that will be good for us. And maybe even in the medium run, it will be good for us. So I don't see austerity happening unless, of course, our leaders want to have austerity, want to impose that, on the American people. Trump, as a dictator, may want to do that. And I think we have to stop him from doing that, in various ways. We're coming to a crisis in that respect at this point. We can see that. If Trump continues to defy court orders and the American people do not rise up in opposition to that, when I say rise up, I mean go into the streets and stay there and be there and perform, a color revolution against Trump. Unless that happens, then Trump will be in a position to impose austerity, on all of us, or any other horrors that he may have in mind. I have hope, though, that Trump will begin to comply with the court orders as the people who work for him are subjected to more and more contempt citations. And we see that they become vulnerable to civil contempt charges that he is not able to free them from. And that then some of these people will begin to peel away from him. Of course, he's losing support from those who were losing billions of dollars to his tariff policies. And pretty soon they will no longer support him. And it will be a fairly brief time before he loses support in the House and the Senate. And it becomes then possible, it'll become possible quickly to impeach him in the House if he goes through with his current course of actions. And it may not be that long until it will be possible to convict him in the Senate. It depends on if he continues to be as outrageous as he is now, and he continues to defy the court orders, and he continues to deport people without any due process. He will soon become an intolerable tyrant to people of all classes in the United States, and the support will then be there to impeach him, okay, and to get rid of him. So I'm not sure all the predictions of Wabin will come true, because hopefully the change internally here may happen before they have had time to all come true. But I respect these particular predictions anyway. They are likely predictions if we assume that there's no change in the internal, the internal American situation, that in turn changes the emphasis in foreign policy as well. Shall we look at the final comments, Dee?
Yes.
Okay, we have one final comment from Steve Holtbrand, who says subscribe. Well, thank you very much, Steve. We had an usually small amount of comments here tonight. Usually people are much more forthcoming with comments. The attendance is pretty good at 52 or so. And I thought the articles we dealt with tonight were extremely interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were very deep in many ways. And anyway, I'm surprised that our comments were not more frequent. Okay, anyway, something wrong with this. Anyway, I do want to say good night then for tonight. I think we are done.
Okay.
And thank you very much, Dee. I'm so glad you were here from 9 to 11. I know that had the great effect of increasing our attendance.
Well, I shared it out more, so.
For those who don't realize, we were on tonight from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock. The first hour was occupied with the Trump-Iran thing. And if you like our stuff, you might want to watch the surviving video to get into the first hour, because I think that was very good as well. So thank you all for coming. And
Thank you for having me.
oh, my pleasure. I take it you will have a stream tomorrow night?
Yes. Not sure who will be joining me, but I know Madeline wants to talk more about Cuba
Okay, very good.
and Ecuador, but she wasn't feeling too good today, so we may do that tomorrow.
Okay, and will you be on Thursday also?
Yes.
Okay, I will be taking Thursday off this week and the whole middle of the week off because I have, some continuing business to do. And I will be back on Saturday night, this time at my usual time of 9 o'clock.
Okay.
So I will see you all then. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of different kinds of news to talk about.
Oh, yes, so much going on.
Yes. So good night, Dee, and good night, everybody.
Yeah, good night, Bonnie.
Good night.
And I will end the stream here.
Okay, good night.
Good night.